Maybe privatizing parts of the U.S. Postal Service is not such a bad idea. Nations other than the United States have a wide range of models for operating their postal services, ranging to fully outsourced to industry. On the other hand, no one matches the scale of the U.S. Postal Service. Well, the Postal Service Office of Inspector General's new white paper details how postal services work in more than 24 nations. Here with the highlights, Research Manager John Althen. Mr. Althen, good to have you with us.
Thanks, Tom. Excited to chat today.
And you are making no recommendations or you have no opinion on this, on what the Congress might do, but what prompted this survey of the nations that also deliver mail?
Yeah, that's right. No formal recommendations in here, but we wanted to provide insights on how different countries are approaching sort of similar problems you see across the world in dealing with declining mail volumes and associated declining revenue from mail. So we wanted to provide information on the different models and how they're different ways they're approaching this challenge.
And I noticed that in the United States, you mentioned 49% of the world's posted pieces go through the U.S. postal system. And, China is a bigger nation, has 4 times as many people, et cetera, et cetera. It's bigger geographically. Do they have a smaller volume because of alternate ways of getting things from place to place? Or just give us a sense of how things get delivered other than postal systems?
Yeah, well, generally, I think it's fair to say across the world, you've seen a earlier and a steeper sort of transition to digitalization. So in terms of e-government services, where the connection of government services is less tied to mail, perhaps, than in the U.S. and other ways like that, that sort of transition may have started earlier or may have been more precipitous in its decline in the past couple decades.
Yes, because by revenue source, when you look at mail, like Spain is the largest. Their postal service has the largest amount of revenue from mail. The United States is kind of in the middle. And, Taiwan has the least. Australia has the least. What can we learn, if anything, from that pattern? It doesn't seem to be related to the form of government or the size of the nation necessarily.
Yeah, well, you can see most posts are still getting a majority or most of their revenue from either mail or parcels, the combination of mail and parcel revenue. You do look, if you look at the more profitable posts, some of those are more diversified in terms of their products available. Here in the U.S., the Postal Service is actually precluded from most types of non-postal products and services, whereas other posts that are remaining profitable have a diversification into products like insurance, financial services, some telecommunications, and that is accompanied by some more business flexibilities that those posts have for their operations.
Right. They're not selling like quarts of milk or anything, but they do sell financial types of services, sounds like.
Yeah, financial types of services and often tied to sort of public services, payments, pension payments, things like that.
And the other big question that you explored was the degree to which other nations impose a universal delivery requirement on their postal services. And of course, everybody knows in the United States, the Postal Service is mandated by the Constitution, I believe, to deliver to every address, whether it's rural Alaska or, the 50th floor in Manhattan. To what extent do other countries have that, or does that vary a lot also?
So all posts have a universal service obligation, which, as you mentioned, is sort of the minimum level of service it is required to provide to residents of the nation. And it does vary. Some general trends you can see comparing the U.S. to the rest of the world is, in some ways, the Postal Service has relatively independent authority over things like service targets. That is the number of days required to get the mail to you. Postal Service has some independent flexibility to control and adjust that, as well as, for instance, the number of post offices. Many nations have a quantitative target, and the Postal Service does not. But in other ways, it's more restricted. I think if you look at what you mentioned, the 6-day delivery requirement to every address, only 4 posts in our sample, including the Postal Service, still have that 6-day. All the others are either at 5-day or at some mix of 3 days or alternating delivery. So that's one area where other posts have gone in the direction of more flexibility or relaxed requirements.
We're speaking with John Althen. He's a research manager for the Research Insights Solution Center at the USPS Office of Inspector General. And that idea of profitability, however that's measured, that relates to what we've been talking about, whether there's universal service or if they can sell other things through their postal services. In the United States, Postal Service is losing money off its balance sheet every year. Are any nations profitable in the sense that there's no net outlay?
In our sample of 25, it was roughly half, split down the middle of posts that are still profitable versus those that are posting annual losses, with the Postal Service being in the annual loss half. I think when we do look at profitability, again, we go back to many of the posts that are most profitable have those diversified revenue streams. I could point you towards DHL, for example, widely known to Americans. It's one of the largest logistics firms in the world. Or perhaps more interesting example is the Italian Post, which is by margins the most profitable post that we observed in our sample, and only about a third of its revenue is coming from mail and parcels. It has highly profitable financial services and other services like that.
All right. Well, maybe you can have your Ferrari oil changed there or something in the Italian post office. And so then to the big question, to what extent are those privatized, and what does privatization really mean? I guess there's a lot of definitions for how that can manifest itself.
Yes, privatization is a pretty nuanced and complicated topic. So 15 posts in our sample were either corporatized, meaning had a corporate structure, legal structure, or were to some degree privatized. I think an important point there is what privatization has meant is a change in legal status to give the post a profit mandate as opposed to just a financial sustainability mandate. Important to point out that in most of the privatized posts, government retains some or a majority share of the equity. Perhaps it might not be the same kind of independence that many think of when they hear privatization. Also, they still have universal service mandates, and there's still the question there of how to pay for those. Many privatized posts have or have requested funding for those not profitable, sort of loss-making service elements of their business.
And is there privatization to any extent in nations that feel like they're close to the United States, such as the European nations, the EU nations, or is that the model in places like China, Vietnam, Thailand?
No, there are European nations that are privatized. The Italian post that I mentioned is partially privatized. Some others I can think of are in the Netherlands. That's actually one that's fully privatized. Royal Mail in the UK is fully privatized. And others like DHL have sort of a minority or mix of government ownership still.
And interestingly, is the model for the postal services, say, in Great Britain or other nations, similar to nationalized industries models that they might have?
No, I wouldn't say it's similar to nationalized where it's a government ministry. India was the only post in our sample that has the post as a ministry. But certainly across all posts, there still is a large government hand, whether that's in reviewing pricing, in reviewing strategic plans, or a more formal role of sort of driving its strategic and operational plans.
And how do we compare? What does China look like? Because that's kind of our rival nation in a lot of ways. And it looks like they get a lot of revenue from financial and banking and insurance and so forth, and relatively little amount from mail, and, a fair slug from parcels and express.
Yes, I'd say China, the model does not resemble very much the U.S., given the Postal Service's reliance on mail and parcel volumes for its revenue versus the different ways that China Post is working to maintain revenues.
And do all postal services suffer, if you will, if that's the word, from just the lack of cultural writing of letters, folding them, licking the envelope, and peeling off a stamp?
Yes, all are facing the same challenge of mail volume decline. As I said earlier, I think some are more, if you will, advanced in that trajectory, some having just a very small percentage of their revenue come from mail volumes and very low mail volumes. And what you see in those nations is they have taken greater steps towards looking at their service mandates and either relaxing or adjusting them to make the post still financially sustainable.
And again, not to ask you to take a position, but is it fair to say that you could read this report and envision a way in which universal service and government oversight and reasonable pricing mechanisms and privatization could coexist?
Yes, I think what we tried to do here is to show that there's many different levers you can pull. I mean, you can look at relaxing the service obligations. You can look at improving efficiency. There's some examples of partnerships to keep retail networks more affordable, for instance. And, funding is on the table, too. In posts like the Netherlands, they are requesting funding, even though they have a much more relaxed and, say, privatized structure. They're still requesting government funding to keep the service there.
Yeah, the idea of daily universal service in any mode, transportation, mail, you name it, is probably not profitable within the human experience in all of history.
Well, yes, when you have a declining market, it makes it more of a challenge to figure out, okay, what are we going to do to keep the service around?
And a final question, the U.S. Postal Service, as it is constituted now, took place in what,